January 22nd, 1879. 11 o'clock in the morning. A British cavalry scout named Trooper Barker crests a rocky ridge in Zululand and stops dead in his tracks. Spread before him across the Ngwebeni Valley, sitting motionless in absolute silence, are 20,000 Zulu warriors. They sit on their shields, arranged in perfect formation, waiting. Barker doesn't know it yet, but he's just stumbled upon the largest military disaster in Victorian British history about to unfold. Within 5 hours, over 1,300 British soldiers will lie dead on the slopes of a mountain called Isandlwana, killed by men armed primarily with spears and cowhide shields. This is the story of how an ancient tactical formation, perfected by a Zulu king named Shaka half a century earlier, destroyed a modern British column equipped with the most advanced rifle in the world. The British Empire in 1879 was at the height of its power. The sun never set on territories painted red across the globe. British soldiers had fought and won against every conceivable enemy, from the steppes of the Crimea to the mountains of Afghanistan. They possessed the Martini-Henry rifle, a technological marvel that could fire 12 rounds per minute at effective ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Each round carried a 480-grain lead bullet that could punch through a man's body and keep going. British military doctrine was built on a simple premise. Modern firepower would always defeat primitive warriors, no matter the odds. This confidence wasn't entirely unfounded. Just 2 years earlier, British forces had crushed the Xhosa people in the 9th Cape Frontier War. At the Battle of Centane, Martini-Henry rifles had stopped charging tribesmen cold, creating fields of bodies before they could close to spear range. The lesson seemed clear. Give British soldiers defensible ground and sufficient ammunition, and they were invincible. But the Zulus were not like other African tribes the British had faced. They were the inheritors of a military revolution that had transformed southern Africa. To understand what happened at Isandlwana, we need to go back 60 years, to a young warrior who would change warfare forever. His name was Shaka Kasenzanga Kona, though history knows him simply as Shaka Zulu. Born around 1787, Shaka was initially an outcast, mocked for his illegitimate birth. But he possessed a brilliant tactical mind and a ruthless determination to revolutionize how wars were fought. Traditional African warfare in the early 1800s was almost ritualistic. Tribes would face each other across open ground, hurling long-throwing spears from a distance. Casualties were light. The defeated would pay tribute in cattle and captives, then everyone went home. It was warfare as theatre, not annihilation. Shaka looked at this system and saw weakness. He replaced the long-throwing spear with a short stabbing weapon called the Ikulwa, named for the sucking sound it made when withdrawn from a body. The blade was broader, the shaft shorter, designed for one purpose: close-quarters killing. He paired this with the Isilangu, a large cowhide shield that could deflect enemy spears and be used offensively to hook an opponent's shield aside, exposing his body to the Ikulwa's blade. But Shaka's true genius was tactical. He created the Impondo Zankomo, the horns of the buffalo. This wasn't just a formation, it was a complete battlefield system designed to encircle and annihilate enemies. The formation consisted of 4 elements. The chest, or isifuba, made up the main body. These were the most experienced warriors, the backbone of the army. They would engage the enemy head-on, pinning them in place. The horns, or impondo, consisted of younger, faster warriors split into left and right flanks. These would race around the enemy's sides, moving to encircle them from behind. The loins, or umuva, were the reserves, typically older veterans who would sit with their backs to the battle to prevent them from being drawn into the fight prematurely. They would be committed only when needed to exploit success or shore up weaknesses. The 4th element was command. Zulu commanders would position themselves on high ground between the main force and the reserves, sending orders via runners. What made this system revolutionary was its coordination. Moving 20,000 men across broken terrain while maintaining formation required iron discipline and extensive training. Zulu warriors drilled constantly, learning to advance in lines, to hold formation under fire, to time their movements to the rhythm of the attack. By the time Shaka was assassinated in 1828, the Zulu kingdom had become the dominant military power in southern Africa. His tactics were studied, refined, and passed down through generations. When Cetshwayo Kampande became king in 1873, he inherited this legacy. Cetshwayo was a formidable figure himself, Contemporary accounts describe him as standing nearly 6 feet 8 inches tall and weighing around 350 pounds. He was intelligent, politically astute, and acutely aware of the growing British threat on his borders. Cetewayo didn't want war with Britain. He considered them allies, even friends. But in 1877, everything changed. The British annexed the Boer Republic of Transvaal, taking over territorial disputes with the Zulu kingdom. Sir Henry Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner for South Africa, had grand ambitions. He wanted to confederate Southern Africa under British rule, similar to what had been done in Canada. But there was an obstacle, an independent Zulu kingdom with a standing army of 40,000 warriors. Frere began manufacturing pretexts for war. He issued demands he knew Cetewayo couldn't accept, complaining about border incidents, insisting on reparations for minor infractions. Cetewayo remained calm, repeatedly stating that he and Frere were equals and that Britain should respect Zulu sovereignty as he respected British rule in the Cape Colony. In December 1878, Frere issued his ultimatum. Cetewayo had 30 days to disband his army, pay massive fines, accept British residence in Zululand, and essentially surrender Zulu independence. It was designed to be rejected. Cetewayo knew accepting meant the end of his kingdom. Refusing meant war. He chose war. Lieutenant General Lord Chelmsford was given command of the invasion force. Frederick Augustus Thesiger, the second Baron Chelmsford, was a career soldier with extensive colonial experience. He'd served in the Crimea, suppressed the Indian Mutiny, and most recently defeated the Xhosa in the Cape Frontier War. That last campaign had given him a dangerously low opinion of African military capabilities. Chelmsford planned a three-pronged invasion designed to converge on Ulundi, the Zulu capital. The central column, which he personally commanded, consisted of approximately 4,700 men. About 1,900 were white British regulars or colonial troops. The remainder were African auxiliaries of the Natal native contingent. The backbone of Chelmsford's force was 5 companies of the 1st Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot, and 1 company from the 2nd Battalion. These were professional soldiers, veterans of imperial campaigns. They were armed with Martini Henry Mark II rifles and carried 70 rounds of ammunition each. Additional ammunition was stored in wooden boxes in the camp's wagon park. On January 11, 1879, Chelmsford's column crossed the Buffalo River at Rorke's Drift and entered Zululand. For the first 10 days, the advance was cautious, almost leisurely. The Zulus seemed to be avoiding contact, melting away before the British column. This reinforced Chelmsford's preconceptions. He began to worry that the Zulus would refuse to fight, that they would scatter, and the war would devolve into endless small skirmishes. He couldn't have been more wrong. King Cetewayo had assembled the main Zulu army near Ulundi. On January 17th, approximately 24,000 warriors began moving toward the British invasion route. They marched in 2 parallel columns, using valleys and dead ground to conceal their movement. On January 21st, they reached the Ngwebeni Valley, about 7 miles from where Chelmsford had established his camp, beneath a distinctive sphinx-shaped mountain called Isandlwana. The Zulu commanders were following Cetewayo's orders to the letter. The king had instructed his generals to wait for an auspicious day to attack, to not rush into battle. He knew British firepower was devastating. He'd equipped some of his warriors with firearms, though these were mostly obsolete muskets, and the Zulus had limited training in their use. The real Zulu weapon was speed, discipline, and their tactical formation. The Zulu army settling into the Ngwebeni Valley on January 21st wasn't a disorganized mob. They were organized into regiments based on age, each with its own name, identity, and distinctive shield patterns. These weren't part-time militia. They were full-time warriors who lived in military, creoles, trained constantly, and knew their roles in the Buffalo Horns formation instinctively. On the morning of January 22nd, Lord Chelmsford made a fatal decision. His scouts had reported Zulu activity about 10 miles to the southeast. Believing this was the main enemy force, Chelmsford split his command. He took about 2,500 men, more than half his column, to pursue what he thought was the Zulu army. He left the camp at Isandlwana under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pauline with approximately 1,800 men, including about 600 British regulars of the 24th Foot. Chelmsford's orders to Pauline were vague: defend the camp, send out patrols. But crucially, Chelmsford didn't order Pauline to fortify the position. British military doctrine called for establishing a defensive laager, circling wagons to create a fortified perimeter. But Chelmsford was supremely confident. The camp was temporary. The Zulus wouldn't attack. There was no need for elaborate defences. This confidence would cost over 1,000 lives. Around 10:30 in the morning, Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Durnford arrived at Isandlwana from Rorke's Drift with approximately 500 men of the Natal Native Horse and a rocket battery. Durnford was one of the most experienced officers in South Africa, a Royal Engineers colonel who knew the country and respected African military capabilities. He was also senior in rank to Pauline, though there was confusion about whether he was supposed to take command or simply reinforce the position. Shortly after Durnford's arrival, reports came in of Zulu movements on the plateau north of the camp. Pauline and Durnford debated what to do. Durnford, aggressive by nature, decided to take the initiative. He requested a company of the 24th Foot to support a reconnaissance in force. Pauline refused, citing his orders to defend the camp. So Durnford took his mounted troops and rocket battery and headed out, intending to engage what he believed was a small Zulu force threatening Chelmsford's rear. This is when Trooper Barker made his discovery. Following Zulu cattle thieves over a ridge, he found himself staring at the main Zulu army. The warriors had been waiting in the Nwabeni Valley, sitting silently, under orders not to attack until the following day when the moon would be favourable. But now they'd been discovered. The element of surprise was gone. Zulu commanders made an instant decision. Attack now. What happened next demonstrated the incredible discipline and coordination of the Zulu military system. Across a front stretching nearly 4 miles, 20,000 warriors rose and began to advance. They didn't charge in a disorganized rush. They moved in their assigned formations, the buffalo horns already taking shape. The chest, approximately 12,000 warriors of the Umkijo, Imbub and Ukandempemvu regiments, advanced directly toward the British camp. To their left, the left horn consisting of the Indluyengwe and Udloko regiments swung wide, approximately 6,000 warriors racing to get around the British right flank. To their right, the right horn of the Unodwengu and Indlondo regiments, another 6,000 warriors, began their encircling movement toward the British left. In reserve, the Isandlwana and Yendlondlo regiments, veteran warriors, waited for orders to commit. Back at the camp, British soldiers saw the Zulu army appear on the horizon like a dark wave. Officers began deploying their men. Companies of the 24th Foot extended in a firing line, 6 deep initially, then thinning to 2 ranks as more troops were committed. The Natal native contingent, African auxiliaries armed mostly with spears and a few old muskets, were positioned on the flanks. This deployment looked impressive on paper. British soldiers were the best-trained infantry in the world, drilled to fire coordinated volleys to maintain discipline under pressure. The Martini Henry rifles they carried were formidable weapons. A good soldier could fire 12 aim shots per minute. The rifle's trajectory was flat out to 400 yards. Beyond that, it required adjustment for drop, but the weapon remained effective past 1,000 yards. The ammunition was devastating. Each cartridge held 85 grains of black powder, driving a 480-grain lead bullet at 350 feet per second. When that soft lead slug hit human flesh, it mushroomed, creating massive wound channels. Wounds to the torso were almost always fatal. Limb strikes would shatter bone. But there were problems the British didn't recognise until too late. First, the defensive line was too extended. To cover the frontage necessary to protect the camp, British soldiers were spread thin, in some places just 2 ranks deep. Second, the camp sat on the forward slope of Isandlwana mountain, meaning there was no clear field of fire. The Zulus could use dead ground, folds in the terrain, to close distance unseen. Third, the ammunition supply was poorly organised. Boxes were stored in the camp, but they were secured with copper bands that required screwdrivers or bayonets to open. Each box contained just 600 rounds, and soldiers in extended firing lines would burn through ammunition quickly. Most critically, Chelmsford had split his force. The boss 800 men at Isandlwana were facing 20,000 Zulu warriors, implementing a tactical system that had been refined over 50 years. The math was brutal. As the Zulus advanced, the British opened fire. At 800 yards, volley fire from the 24th Foot began to take effect. Zulu warriors fell. The Martini Henry rounds punched through shields, through bodies, sometimes through multiple men. At 600 yards, the fire intensified. The distinctive crack of the Martini, Henry was constant, a rolling thunder of rifle fire. But the Zulus didn't break. They didn't panic. They kept coming. The chest of the buffalo advanced at a steady jog, warriors moving in loose skirmishing lines, not the tight formations European armies used. When men fell, others stepped over them and continued. The British had never seen anything like it. African armies they'd fought before would break under sustained rifle fire, would run when casualties mounted. But the Zulus had been drilled for this. They'd been taught to expect losses, to keep moving, to trust in their numbers and their tactics. At 400 yards, the fire became truly devastating. Entire sections of the Zulu front rank disappeared under the fusillade. Bodies piled up. The chest of the buffalo began to slow, warriors going to ground, using whatever cover they could find. For a moment it seemed the British firepower would prevail. The frontal assault was stalling. Officers of the 24th Foot allowed themselves to hope. This was just like Centane. Like every other colonial battle, modern rifles would win. But the British had focused on the chest. They hadn't paid enough attention to the horns. Out on the British right flank, Colonel Durnford's mounted troops were being overwhelmed. The Zulu left horn had swung wide faster than anyone anticipated. These were young warriors, the fastest runners in the Zulu army, and they were executing their manoeuvre perfectly. Durnford's men, outnumbered and armed with inferior weapons, the Natal native horse, carried obsolete carbines, and many had only traditional weapons, began to fall back. The rocket battery, which should have provided supporting fire, malfunctioned. The rockets flew wildly, more dangerous to the British than the Zulus. As Durnford retreated toward the camp, his force disintegrated. Some men made it back to the British lines, many didn't. The Zulu left horn had achieved its objective. They were now behind the British right flank. Simultaneously, on the British left, the Zulu right horn was completing its own encircling movement. This horn had swung even wider, using Isandlwana mountain itself as concealment. British observers stationed on high ground had seen them, but there weren't enough troops to stop the manoeuvre. Companies of the 24th Foot tried to extend their line leftward, but they were already stretched thin. The Natal native contingent, positioned on the extreme left, saw thousands of Zulu warriors emerging from behind the mountain. These African auxiliaries weren't British regulars. They were poorly armed, poorly trained, and when they saw the Zulu right horn about to envelop them, they broke. Officers tried to rally them, a few units held, but most scattered, fleeing toward Rorke's Drift, abandoning the British left flank. Now the buffalo horns were closing. The Zulu chest, having regrouped after the initial volleys stalled their advance, began pushing forward again. The British firing line was now engaged on three sides, front, right and left. The tactical situation was collapsing. Back in the camp, quartermasters were desperately trying to supply ammunition to the firing line, but the system was breaking down. The copper bands on the ammunition boxes required tools to open. In the chaos, soldiers were smashing boxes open with rocks, with rifle butts, wasting precious time. Some units were down to their last rounds. Runners were sent back for more ammunition, but the wagons were scattered across the camp. Different battalions had different ammunition boxes. In the confusion, some soldiers received the wrong caliber ammunition. Martini Henry rifles fell silent as men ran out of rounds. Officers began to realize the horror of their situation. They weren't holding a defensive perimeter. They were surrounded. The buffalo horns had closed. The only escape route was back toward Rorke's Drift, and even that was being cut off as the Zulu horns completed their envelopment. Around 12:30 in the afternoon, less than 2 hours after the battle began, the British line broke. It didn't happen all at once. Individual companies, seeing Zulus closing from multiple directions, began to fall back toward the camp. The retreat became a rout. The moment British soldiers turned their backs, Zulu warriors closed for the kill. This was what the Iklwa was designed for. At close quarters, Zulu warriors were devastating. The stabbing spear was faster than a rifle with a bayonet. The large shield could deflect thrusts, then hook aside an enemy's guard. Zulu warriors had trained their entire lives for this moment. Hand-to-hand combat on the slopes of Isandlwana was brutal and one-sided. British soldiers, trained for volley fire and bayonet charges, found themselves outmatched against men who'd perfected close-quarters killing as an art form. Some companies of the 24th Foot tried to form last stands. On a rocky outcrop, later called the Neck, a group of soldiers gathered, fixing bayonets, preparing to sell their lives dearly. They managed to hold for perhaps 20 minutes, maintaining fire discipline even as Zulus surrounded them. When their ammunition ran out, they used bayonets, rifle butts, even their fists. They all died there. Other soldiers fled toward the Buffalo River, hoping to reach Natal. Most never made it. Zulu warriors pursued, cutting down fleeing men. The river ran red with blood. Bodies piled up at the crossing points. Perhaps 60 European soldiers escaped Isandlwana. Over 300 died. The casualty figures tell the story of annihilation. Of the 24th Regiment of Foot, 52 officers and 806 non-commissioned ranks were killed. The Natal native contingent lost 471 men. Royal artillery crews died at their guns. Engineers, commissary staff, wagon drivers, all were caught in the slaughter. Zulu casualties were also severe. Estimates range from 100 to 2,500 dead, with thousands more wounded. The chest of the buffalo, which had absorbed the concentrated British fire for nearly 2 hours, suffered the worst. Entire regiments were decimated. King Cetshwayo would later say, "An assegai has been thrust into the belly of the nation." But the Zulus had won. The Buffalo Horns formation, executed across broken terrain against modern firearms, had worked exactly as Shaka had designed it 60 years earlier. The chest pinned the enemy. The horns encircled them. The reserves were committed to exploit success. Coordination, discipline, and tactical superiority had overcome technological advantage. When Lord Chelmsford returned to Isandlwana late in the afternoon, having chased phantom Zulu forces all day, he found a scene of absolute horror. The camp was destroyed. Bodies lay everywhere. Wagons were looted. Equipment was scattered across the battlefield. Chelmsford reportedly said, "But I left a strong force here." He couldn't comprehend what had happened. The British Army had suffered its worst defeat against a technologically inferior enemy in its history. Victorian society was stunned. How could modern British soldiers, armed with the best rifles in the world, lose to men with spears? But they hadn't lost to men with spears. They'd lost to a sophisticated military system, to tactics refined through generations, to an army that understood how to coordinate large-scale maneuvers and maintain discipline under fire. The Buffalo Horns formation wasn't primitive. It was brilliant. The aftermath of Isandlwana would reshape the Anglo-Zulu War. The British, humiliated, poured reinforcements into South Africa. By July 1879, Chelmsford commanded an army of 17,000 men, equipped with artillery and Gatling guns. They adopted square formations, concentrating firepower to prevent encirclement. At the Battle of Ulundi on July 4th, the Zulus tried the Buffalo Horns again. But this time, the British were prepared. They formed a massive square, 5 battalions strong, with artillery and Gatling guns at the corners. When the Zulus attacked, they charged into concentrated fire from all sides. The battle lasted 45 minutes. British casualties were 10 killed, 87 wounded. Zulu casualties were estimated at 500 dead. Firepower, properly employed with defensive tactics, proved decisive. But Ulundi came after Isandlwana. The Buffalo Horns had already proven their effectiveness. The formation that destroyed the British column on January 22, 1879, remains one of history's most successful tactical manoeuvres. Shaka's genius, preserved and perfected by his successors, had achieved what seemed impossible, defeating a modern army using tactics designed before the Industrial Revolution. The Zulu military system offers lessons that echo through military history. Superior technology doesn't guarantee victory. Tactics, training, and coordination matter more than equipment. An army that understands its doctrine and executes it with discipline can overcome significant disadvantages. The Buffalo Horns formation worked because every Zulu warrior knew his role. The runners who carried messages across the battlefield, the commanders who coordinated movements from high ground, the veterans who waited patiently in reserve, the young warriors of the Horns who raced miles to complete the envelopment, all executed their parts of a complex plan under fire. British soldiers, for all their training and firepower, weren't prepared for this. They expected African warriors to break under rifle fire, to fight as disorganized mobs. The Zulus did neither. They advanced with purpose, accepted casualties as the price of victory, and maintained tactical cohesion even when the chest was being shredded by Martini Henry fire. The weapons tell part of the story. The Ikalwa, that short stabbing spear, seems primitive compared to a rifle. But in close quarters, after the firing line broke, it was devastatingly effective. The Isilangu shield, made of cowhide stretched over a wooden frame, couldn't stop bullets, but it could deflect spear thrusts and provide psychological protection, allowing warriors to advance under fire. The Martini Henry rifle was a marvel of Victorian engineering, but it required ammunition, and at Isandlwana, the ammunition supply failed. It required open fields of fire, and the broken terrain around the mountain didn't provide them. It required defensive positions, and Chelmsford's overconfidence meant none were prepared. Superior weapons in the hands of troops caught in the wrong tactical situation become liabilities. The psychological impact of Isandlwana resonated far beyond the battlefield. In Britain, the defeat shocked a nation convinced of its military invincibility. How could this happen? The newspapers demanded answers. A court of inquiry was convened, which largely blamed Colonel Durnford, who had the misfortune of being dead and therefore unable to defend himself. Modern historians have mostly exonerated Durnford, recognising that Chelmsford's decisions, splitting his force and not fortifying the camp, were the real causes of the disaster. For the Zulus, Isandlwana was both triumph and tragedy. They had proven their military prowess, defending their kingdom against foreign invasion. King Cetshwayo had hoped that defeating the British would bring them to the negotiating table, that Britain would recognise Zulu sovereignty. He was wrong. The British response was overwhelming force. More troops, more guns, a methodical campaign that ultimately destroyed Zulu independence. By August 1879, Cetshwayo was captured and sent into exile. His kingdom was partitioned, divided among chiefs loyal to Britain. The military system Shaka had built was dismantled. The regiments were disbanded. The age-grade system that had organised Zulu society around military service was destroyed. In 1887, Zululand was formally annexed by Britain. The independence that the Buffalo Horns had defended so effectively at Isandlwana was lost forever. But the tactical legacy remained. Military historians studied the battle, trying to understand how an inferior force could achieve such a complete victory. The principles were clear: encirclement, coordination, disciplined execution of a battle plan. These weren't unique to the Zulus. Hannibal had used similar tactics at Cannae in 216 BC, encircling and destroying a Roman army twice his size, but the Zulus had adapted these principles to their specific circumstances, creating a formation that worked against enemies with firearms. The key was speed and surprise. The Horns had to move faster than the enemy could redeploy to counter them. At Isandlwana, the Zulu left Horn covered several miles of rough terrain in less than 2 hours, maintaining formation the entire time. That required incredible physical conditioning and tactical awareness. The chest had to pin the enemy without being destroyed. This required accepting heavy casualties, trusting that the Horns would complete their mission before the centre broke. At Isandlwana, the chest took the worst of the British fire but held long enough for the encirclement to succeed. The reserves had to be committed at exactly the right moment. Too early, and they'd be wasted. Too late, and the opportunity would pass. Zulu commanders, watching from high ground, had to read the battle and make split-second decisions about when to commit their veteran warriors. All of this happened without radio, without telegraph, without any modern communication system. Orders were carried by runners, men who raced across the battlefield under fire to deliver instructions. The Zulu military system was built on human coordination, on warriors who trained together their entire lives and understood battlefield signals intuitively. Compare this to the British system, which relied on rigid formations, drum signals, and officers who were often unfamiliar with their men. The 24th Foot were professional soldiers, but they'd only recently been posted to South Africa. Many had never seen combat. They trusted in their rifles and their training, but they'd never faced an enemy like the Zulus. The colonial troops and African auxiliaries were even less prepared. The Natal native contingent had been hastily raised, given minimal training, and armed with whatever weapons were available. When the Zulu right horn appeared behind Isandlwana mountain, these men did what any rational soldier would do. They ran. The British officers who later blamed them for cowardice missed the point. These weren't cowards. They were men who recognised an impossible situation and chose survival. The professional soldiers of the 24th Foot mostly stayed and died. Their regimental pride, their training, their British identity, all demanded they hold the line. But pride doesn't stop spears. Training doesn't replenish ammunition. Identity doesn't create defensive positions. The 24th Foot fought bravely and uselessly, dying in place because their commanders had put them in an untenable position. This is the deeper lesson of Isandlwana. Tactical brilliance can overcome bravery. The Zulus didn't win through superior courage. Both sides showed incredible bravery. The Zulus won through superior tactics, better coordination, and a clearer understanding of the battlefield. The buffalo horns formation was designed to win, not to showcase bravery. It was a killing system, refined, through decades of warfare, adapted to overcome enemy advantages. Against the British at Isandlwana, it worked perfectly. Modern military forces still study Isandlwana, though usually as a cautionary tale about overconfidence and poor reconnaissance. But the positive lessons are equally valuable. The Zulus demonstrated that tactics matter more than technology, that coordination and discipline can overcome firepower, that understanding your enemy's weaknesses is more important than counting their strengths. The British had superior range and firepower, but those advantages meant nothing once the battle moved to close quarters. The Zulus had superior tactics and better situational awareness. They used terrain, speed, and coordination to negate British firepower, then closed to the distance where their weapons were most effective. This wasn't luck. This was brilliant military execution. Today, the battlefield at Isandlwana is a heritage site. Whitewashed cairns mark where British soldiers fell. Zulu memorial stones stand nearby. Tourists visit trying to understand how such a slaughter occurred. The mountain still dominates the landscape, its sphinx-like profile unchanged. The ground where 20,000 warriors appeared from the Ngwebeni Valley is still there, though now it's farmland. The tactical geography that allowed the buffalo horns to work so effectively is preserved. Standing there, you can visualize how it happened, how the chest advanced down the slope, absorbing fire, how the left horn swept wide across the plateau, how the right horn used the mountain itself as cover, how the British, spread too thin and caught by surprise, had no answer. The names of the Zulu regiments echo through history. The Ukandempemvu, the Whiteheads, who formed part of the chest and bore the brunt of British fire. The Indliangwe, the mottled ones, who made up part of the left horn and helped complete the encirclement. The Isandlwana, the reserve regiment of veterans who were committed at the crucial moment. These weren't faceless masses. They were organised military units with proud traditions, commanded by experienced officers, fighting for their homeland against foreign invasion. The British soldiers have names too, inscribed on memorials. Lieutenant Melville and Coghill, who tried to save the Queen's colours and drowned in the Buffalo River. Lieutenant Colonel Pauline, who died defending the camp he'd been ordered to hold. Colonel Durnford, who made a last stand protecting the road to Rorke's Drift, allowing others to escape. Private Williams, whose body was found surrounded by dead Zulus, testimony to a final desperate fight. These men deserve to be remembered, not for victory but for sacrifice. They were let down by their commanders, placed in an impossible situation, and died doing their duty as they understood it. The Zulu warriors who fell deserve equal remembrance. They fought for their independence, their way of life, their kingdom. They faced modern rifles with traditional weapons and prevailed through skill and courage. That their ultimate victory at Isandlwana couldn't save their kingdom from eventual British conquest doesn't diminish their achievement on that January day. The Buffalo Horns formation, the Impondo Zankomo, remains one of history's great tactical innovations. Conceived by Shaka Zulu in the 1810s, perfected through decades of warfare, it achieved its greatest triumph at Isandlwana in 1879. The formation required speed, discipline, and coordination beyond what most armies could achieve. The Zulus mastered it, and on January 22, 1879, they used it to destroy a modern British column and shock the Victorian world. The lesson echoes through time. Never underestimate an enemy who understands tactics better than you do. Never assume technology guarantees victory. Never split your forces in the face of an enemy whose capabilities you don't fully understand. Lord Chelmsford learned these lessons too late. The sus 300 men who died at Isandlwana paid the price for his overconfidence. The Zulu kingdom won its greatest military victory, but couldn't escape the inevitable British response. History remembers Isandlwana as a disaster for the British Empire, but it should also be remembered as a masterpiece of tactical execution, the day when an ancient formation proved it could still defeat a modern army, when the horns of the buffalo closed around a British column and changed military history forever. The tactical sophistication of the Zulu military system extended far beyond the basic buffalo horns formation. What made the Impondo Zankamo so devastatingly effective at Isandlwana was the decades of institutional knowledge embedded in every level of Zulu military organisation. This wasn't improvised battlefield manoeuvring, it was systematic warfare developed through continuous refinement and combat experience across southern Africa. The regimental system itself was a marvel of social engineering that Shaka had pioneered. Every Zulu male was enrolled in an age-grade regiment called an Ibutho around the age of 14. These young men would serve together for their entire military careers, living in military kraals scattered across the kingdom. They trained constantly, learning not just individual combat skills but collective movements, how to advance in lines, how to maintain formation across broken terrain, how to respond to commands delivered by runners in the chaos of battle. The psychological bonds created by this system were crucial. Warriors fought alongside men they'd known since childhood, for officers they respected, in regiments with proud histories. This created a level of cohesion European armies achieved only in the elite units. For the Zulus, every regiment was elite. The age-grade system also created natural divisions of labour in the buffalo horns formation. The youngest warriors, typically those in their late teens and early 20s, formed the horns. These regiments were called the Udabi carriers when very young, then graduated to full warrior status around age 18 or 19. They were the fastest, most athletic warriors in the army, capable of running for miles at speeds that left European observers astonished. Contemporary British accounts describe Zulu warriors maintaining a steady 6 to 7 miles per hour jog across rough terrain for extended periods, with bursts of running speed approaching 15 miles per hour during the final assault. This wasn't superhuman endurance, it was the result of a lifetime spent walking and running across the hills of Zululand, bodies adapted to high-altitude exertion and cardiovascular demands that would exhaust European soldiers. At Isandlwana, the left horn, consisting primarily of the Ndluyengwe and Udoloko regiments, covered approximately 5 miles of extremely broken terrain in roughly 90 minutes while maintaining tactical formation. This meant they were moving at over 3 miles per hour across ground that included rocky outcrops, dry stream beds, thick vegetation, and steep inclines. Meanwhile, they had to maintain visual contact with other elements of the army, respond to commands from distant commanders, and preserve enough energy to fight effectively upon reaching their objective. The right horn had an even more demanding task. The Unodwengu and Indlondo regiments had to swing even wider, using Isandlwana mountain itself as cover. This meant climbing several hundred feet in elevation, circling behind the British position, then descending to attack from the rear. They accomplished this in approximately the same time frame as the left horn, demonstrating extraordinary physical conditioning and tactical awareness. The chest of the buffalo bore the most dangerous role. These were typically more experienced warriors, men in their late 20s through their 40s who had proven themselves in previous campaigns. The Umsijo, Imbube, and Ukandempemvu regiments that formed the chest at Isandlwana included many veterans of earlier conflicts. These men knew what they were facing. They'd heard about the devastating effects of rifle fire from survivors of previous skirmishes with colonial forces. They advanced anyway, trusting in their tactics and their commanders. The casualties among the chest were horrific. Estimates suggest that between 800 and 1,500 warriors died in the frontal assault, with perhaps twice that number wounded. The Ukandempemvu regiment alone may have lost half its strength. These men absorbed British fire for nearly 2 hours, buying time for the horns to complete their encirclement. The discipline required to maintain this advance under sustained rifle fire cannot be overstated. European military observers had long assumed that African warriors would break under modern firepower, that the psychological shock of watching comrades torn apart by bullets would cause mass panic. At Isandlwana, the Zulu chest proved this. Assumption catastrophically wrong. Warriors went to ground when fire became too intense, using whatever cover was available, then resumed their advance when opportunities presented. Small groups would rush forward, while others provided covering fire with the limited firearms the Zulus possessed. The coordination wasn't perfect, casualties disrupted formations and some units wavered, but the overall advance never stopped. This was the product of training and indoctrination that began in childhood. Zulu warriors were taught that death in battle was honourable, that showing fear brought shame to their regiment and their families. They were conditioned to follow orders even when those orders meant advancing into almost certain death. The reserve regiments, the Loins of the Buffalo, demonstrated a different kind of discipline. The Isandlwana and Indlondlo regiments sat with their backs to the battle for much of the engagement, a traditional practice designed to prevent premature commitment of reserves. These were veteran warriors who could hear the rifle fire, who knew their comrades were dying, who every instinct told them to join the fight. They sat and waited for orders. When those orders finally came, they advanced as a coherent force, not as individuals rushing to help. They were committed at the decisive moment, when the British line was collapsing and fresh troops could exploit the breakthrough. This kind of fire discipline in reserve forces was rare in European armies of the period and almost unheard of in other African military systems. The command and control system that coordinated all these moving parts was remarkably sophisticated. Zulu commanders positioned themselves on high ground, typically a ridge or hill that offered clear views of the battlefield. At Isandlwana, the main Zulu command post was probably on the ridge overlooking the Ngwebeni Valley, about 2 miles from the British camp. From there, commanders could observe the entire battle, track the progress of each element of the Buffalo Horns, and send orders via runners. These runners, young warriors selected for speed and reliability, would race across the battlefield carrying verbal orders to regimental commanders. The system required clear chains of command, officers who could make quick decisions based on imperfect information, and warriors who trusted their leaders enough to follow orders without question. Compare this to the British command situation at Isandlwana, where Lieutenant Colonel Pauline was trying to manage a fluid battle while lacking clear intelligence about enemy strength or intentions. He couldn't see the Zulu left horn completing its envelopment because the terrain blocked his view. He didn't realise the right horn was behind Isandlwana mountain until it emerged to attack his left flank. British military doctrine of the period emphasised rigid formations and direct command by officers on the firing line. This worked well in European warfare where battles were fought on relatively open terrain, and enemies used similar tactics. Against the Zulus employing encirclement across broken ground, it proved inadequate. Pauline made reasonable decisions based on what he could see, but he couldn't see the strategic picture. The Zulu commanders could, and they exploited that advantage ruthlessly. The weapons the Zulus carried tell their own story about tactical adaptation. The primary weapon remained Shaka's Iklwa, the short stabbing spear with a blade typically 18 to 24 inches long and 3 to 4 inches wide at its broadest point. The shaft was only about 2.5 feet long, forcing close quarters engagement. This was deliberate. Shaka had reasoned that warriors armed with throwing spears would exhaust their ammunition quickly, then be defenceless. Warriors with stabbing spears had unlimited ammunition. Their weapons couldn't be picked up and thrown back by enemies, and close combat favoured the better trained force. The Iklwa was designed to be thrust underhand, targeting the abdomen below the ribs where vital organs were vulnerable, and the diaphragm could be punctured. The broad blade created massive internal damage. The spear was then twisted and withdrawn, the sucking sound that gave the weapon its onomatopoetic name. Warriors trained extensively with the Iklwa, practicing thrusts against padded targets, learning to strike with maximum force, to recover quickly for a second thrust, to use the weapon in conjunction with the shield. The Isilangu shield was equally sophisticated in its design and employment. Made from cowhide stretched over a wooden frame, these shields were large, typically 4 to 5 feet tall and 2 feet wide. The hide came from cattle, with patterns indicating the warrior's regiment. Young warriors carried black shields, mature warriors carried white or red patterns, creating visual identification on the battlefield. The shield wasn't just defensive. Warriors were trained to hook the left edge of their shield behind an enemy's shield, pulling it aside to expose the enemy's left side to an Iklwa thrust. The shield could also be used offensively, slamming into opponents to throw them off balance. In close quarters, shield work was as important as spear work. At Isandlwana, once the Zulus closed with British forces, these techniques proved devastatingly effective against soldiers trained primarily in bayonet drill. The Zulus also carried throwing spears, though their use was limited. These were lighter weapons with longer shafts, thrown in the initial stages of combat to disrupt enemy formations. Some warriors carried multiple throwing spears along with their Iklwa. British accounts from Isandlwana describe volleys of thrown spears preceding the final assault, though the casualties inflicted were minimal compared to close quarters combat. More significant were the firearms some Zulu warriors carried. King Cetshwayo had accumulated several thousand muskets and rifles through trade and capture over the years. These range from ancient flintlock muskets dating back decades to relatively modern rifles like the Snyder Enfield and even a few Martini Henrys captured from earlier skirmishes. The problem was ammunition and training. The Zulus had limited gunpowder and couldn't manufacture cartridges for breech-loading rifles. Warriors with firearms often had only a handful of rounds. Training was minimal. Most Zulu warriors had never fired a gun before being issued one, and marksmanship was poor. At Isandlwana, Zulu firearms probably killed relatively few British soldiers. Their primary effect was psychological, the crack of gunfire adding to the chaos and giving British troops the impression they were facing a more heavily armed enemy than they actually were. Some Zulu regiments didn't carry firearms at all, relying entirely on traditional weapons. This actually didn't disadvantage them significantly. The Iklewa remained the more effective weapon once battle was joined at close quarters. A trained warrior could strike faster with a spear than a soldier could work a bolt-action rifle and fix a bayonet. The shield provided better protection than nothing at all, and Zulu warriors were far more experienced in hand-to-hand combat than British soldiers, whose training emphasised marksmanship and volley fire. The British Martini Henry rifle, for all its technological sophistication, had significant limitations that became apparent at Isandlwana. The weapon fired a massive 5.77 450 caliber cartridge, the case measuring 2.5 inches long and loaded with 85 grains of black powder. This generated tremendous recoil, making rapid aimed fire difficult. The rifle weighed nearly 10 pounds, exhausting to carry and aim for extended periods. Most critically, the Martini Henry generated huge amounts of black powder smoke. Each shot produced a cloud that obscured vision, and in extended engagements the cumulative smoke created a fog bank that made target acquisition nearly impossible. At Isandlwana, British soldiers firing continuously for over an hour created smoke so thick that officers reported being unable to see more than a few dozen yards. This dramatically reduced the effectiveness of British firepower. The Martini Henry's advantage was its range and accuracy at distances exceeding several hundred yards. Once visibility dropped to 50 yards or less, that advantage disappeared. The rifle also had mechanical issues under sustained fire. The breech block could overheat, making the action difficult to operate. Spent cartridges would swell from heat and humidity, jamming in the chamber and requiring forceful extraction. This problem was exacerbated by the ammunition supply issues at Isandlwana. The copper band securing ammunition boxes required tools to remove, slowing resupply during critical moments. Some soldiers received ammunition that didn't fit their rifles. Different batches had slightly different case dimensions. Others ran completely dry, reduced to using their rifles as clubs when Zulus overran their positions. The Martini Henry was a superb weapon when properly employed with adequate ammunition and good fields of fire. At Isandlwana, none of those conditions existed, and the rifle's limitations became fatal vulnerabilities. The tactical employment of firearms by both sides reveals important lessons about technology and warfare. The British possessed superior weapons but failed to employ them effectively. They extended their firing line too thin, didn't fortify their position, and allowed themselves to be caught by a force that could close to close quarters range before firepower could break their attack. The Zulus possessed inferior firearms but used them as one component of an integrated tactical system, where close quarters weapons were primary and firearms were supplementary. They understood that rifles were tools, not magic, and that properly executed tactics could overcome technological disadvantages. This distinction between owning advanced technology and effectively employing it is crucial. The British assumed their Martini Henry rifles would guarantee victory regardless of tactics or terrain. The Zulus assumed nothing and planned their attack to minimize British advantages while maximizing their own strengths in mobility, numbers, and close combat capability. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true cost to both sides. British casualties were catastrophic by Victorian standards. Of the roughly 600 men in the camp, approximately 1,350 died. This included 52 officers and 806 soldiers of the 24th Foot, 471 African auxiliaries of the native contingent, and assorted artillery, engineers, and civilian personnel. Only about 55 Europeans escaped, most of them mounted troops who could outrun pursuing Zulus. Another 300 or so Africans of the NNC survived, many by discarding their uniforms and weapons and claiming to be refugees. The survivors brought horrific tales of the final minutes of the battle, of hand-to-hand fighting in the camp, of wounded men killed where they lay, of desperate last stands on rocky outcrops. These accounts shaped British perceptions of the Zulus as savage warriors, though the reality was more complex. Zulu military custom called for killing enemy warriors to the last man. This wasn't savagery but military doctrine. Wounded enemies could recover and fight again. The practice horrified Victorian sensibilities, but was tactically rational. Zulu casualties at Isandlwana are harder to quantify. Contemporary estimates range from 1,000 to over 3,000 dead. Modern historians generally accept figures around 1,500 to 2,000 killed, with perhaps twice that wounded. The difference in casualty ratios, roughly one Zulu dead for every British soldier killed, reflects the effectiveness of British firepower, even in defeat. The Martini Henry rifle, properly employed, was a devastating weapon. The problem was that there weren't enough British soldiers to maintain fire along the entire perimeter once the encirclement was complete. Zulu commanders had calculated correctly that they could absorb the casualties necessary to close with British forces, and once at close quarters, their numerical superiority would prevail. The dead were disproportionately from the chest regiments that bore the brunt of rifle fire. The Ukandempemvu regiment was particularly hard hit, losing perhaps half its warriors. These casualties were mourned throughout Zululand, not celebrated. King Cetshwayo, upon learning the cost of victory, reportedly said, "The nation is eaten up." The wounded presented their own challenges. Zulu warriors carried their wounded comrades from the battlefield when possible, but many were left where they fell, dying slowly from gunshot wounds in the South African sun. British wounded received no mercy. Zulu military custom and the heat of battle meant wounded British soldiers were killed. A few exceptions existed, men who were overlooked or protected by Zulu warriors who chose mercy over custom. But these were rare. The brutality worked both ways. In the battles that followed Isandlwana, British soldiers took few Zulu prisoners, shooting wounded warriors and executing captives in retaliation for the massacre. The war became increasingly bitter, both sides committing atrocities that would be remembered for generations. The psychological impact on survivors was profound. Lieutenant Horace Smith-Dorrien, one of the few British officers to escape Isandlwana, later wrote about the experience. He was a transport officer who managed to reach the Buffalo River, where his exhausted horse collapsed. He swam the river under fire, Zulu warriors throwing spears from the bank, and staggered into Natal with nothing but his wet uniform. Smith-Dorrien would go on to become a general in World War I, serving with distinction. But he said Isandlwana remained the most terrifying experience of his life. The image of thousands of Zulu warriors sweeping across the battlefield, the sound of gunfire giving way to screams and the clash of close combat, haunted him for decades. Other survivors reported similar psychological trauma, what we would now recognise as post-traumatic stress disorder. Men woke screaming from nightmares of being overrun, of hand-to-hand fighting, of watching comrades die. For the Zulus, the aftermath was also traumatic. Young warriors who had never seen combat before experienced the horror of modern warfare. The Martini Henry rifle created wounds unlike anything in traditional African warfare. Men were blown apart by the heavy bullets, limbs shattered, abdomens torn open. The casualties among the chest regiments meant that nearly every warrior who survived had watched friends and relatives die. The victory celebration was muted. Traditional Zulu custom called for warriors to wash their spears after battle, to ritually cleanse themselves of the killing. After Isandlwana, the ceremonies were sombre acknowledgements of the price paid rather than triumphant celebrations. The realization that defeating the British had required such losses raised questions about whether the war could be won. The British had lost one column but had two more intact, and everyone knew reinforcements would come from across the sea. Cetshwayo had hoped that a decisive victory would bring the British to negotiations. Instead, it guaranteed total war. The strategic consequences of Isandlwana reverberated throughout the British Empire. In London, the news arrived by telegraph in early February 1879, creating immediate political crisis. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli faced intense criticism for allowing the war to begin. The opposition demanded investigations. How could such a disaster occur? Who was responsible? Sir Henry Bartle Frere, the High Commissioner who had manufactured the war, became a scapegoat. His reputation never recovered. Lord Chelmsford faced intense scrutiny. A court of inquiry was convened, but its findings were inconclusive, spreading blame among several officers, including the dead Colonel Durnford. Chelmsford retained his command, but knew his career depended on avenging Isandlwana. The British government authorised massive reinforcements. 6 additional infantry battalions, 2 cavalry regiments, artillery batteries, and supporting units were dispatched to South Africa. By April 1879, British forces in the region exceeded 20,000 men, the largest colonial army assembled since the Indian Mutiny. The military lessons were studied intensely. How had the Zulus achieved such success? British officers analysed captured Zulu weapons, interrogated prisoners, and interviewed survivors. They came to respect the sophistication of Zulu tactics while developing countermeasures. Future operations would employ concentrated forces moving in defensive formations that couldn't be easily flanked. The square formation became standard, infantry arranged in a hollow square with artillery and supplies in the centre. When Zulus attacked, they would face concentrated fire from all sides. Reconnaissance was intensified, mounted patrols ranged far ahead of columns to prevent surprise. Supply lines were secured, ammunition was kept close to firing positions. Most importantly, British commanders abandoned their contempt for African military capabilities. The Zulus were now recognised as a formidable enemy, requiring serious tactical consideration. These changes were implemented during the second invasion of Zululand in May and June 1879. Chelmsford moved cautiously, his columns advancing slowly with extensive fortifications each night. When Zulu armies were located, British forces formed their defensive squares and waited for attack. The Zulus, still employing the Buffalo Horns formation, found they couldn't penetrate the concentrated firepower. At Kambula on March 29, 1879, British forces in a fortified position defeated a Zulu army, inflicting over 1,000 casualties while losing only 29 dead. At Ulundi on July 4th, the final battle, the British square proved impenetrable. The Zulu horns closed but couldn't reach the British lines through the wall of rifle and artillery fire. The tactical system that had worked so brilliantly at Isandlwana failed when the British adapted their tactics. This demonstrated that the Buffalo Horns wasn't invincible. It was effective only when employed against enemies using inappropriate tactics. British forces caught in extended lines without fortifications were vulnerable. British forces in concentrated defensive positions were not. The Zulu military system itself was ultimately unsustainable. The regimental structure required large standing armies of young men who didn't engage in agricultural labour, supported by the kingdom's pastoral economy. This worked in peacetime or in short wars, but extended conflict strained the system. After Isandlwana, the main Zulu army scattered to rest and regroup. Reassembling them took weeks. Meanwhile, British forces remained in the field continuously, supplied by the industrial economy of the empire. The Zulus couldn't replace their casualties as quickly as the British could ship reinforcements from across the world. They couldn't manufacture ammunition for their limited firearms. They couldn't match British artillery or cavalry. Once the British adapted their tactics to counter the Buffalo Horns, the Zulus had no answer. Their military system, for all its sophistication, was designed for pre-industrial warfare. Against an industrial power like Britain that could learn from defeats and adapt, the Zulus were ultimately overmatched. King Cetshwayo understood this reality. After Isandlwana, he repeatedly sent peace overtures to the British, offering to disband his army, pay reparations, accept whatever terms would end the war. The British refused. The humiliation of Isandlwana demanded complete victory and the destruction of Zulu military power. Chelmsford needed to erase the stain on his reputation with an overwhelming triumph. The war would continue until the Zulu kingdom was destroyed. In July 1879, Chelmsford's reinforced army marched on Ulundi, the Zulu capital. Cetshwayo assembled his army for a final defence, approximately 20,000 warriors, many veterans of Isandlwana. They employed the Buffalo Horns formation one last time, but against an enemy prepared for it. The British square held. Gatling guns and artillery massacred the Zulu chest. The Horns found no flanks to envelop. Within an hour the Zulu army was broken, fleeing across the plains. Chelmsford ordered Ulundi burned, the royal kraal destroyed, Cetshwayo escaped but was captured in August, his kingdom partitioned among compliant chiefs. The military system that Shaka had built was dismantled by British decree. The age-grade regiments were disbanded. Warriors were forced to return to civilian life. The sophisticated command structure that had coordinated the buffalo horns at Isandlwana ceased to exist. Within a generation, the tactical knowledge that had been passed from Shaka through Dingane, Mapande and Cetshwayo was lost. Today, Isandlwana stands as a memorial to both tragedy and triumph. For the British, it remains their worst colonial defeat, a cautionary tale about arrogance and underestimating enemies. For the Zulus, it represents their greatest military victory, proof that their ancestors possessed tactical brilliance that could defeat the world's most powerful empire, if only temporarily. The battlefield itself is preserved. The whitewashed cairns marking British dead contrast with Zulu memorial stones, both honoured. The mountain of Isandlwana still dominates the landscape, its sphinx-like profile unchanged. Visitors walk the ground where the buffalo horns closed, where modern rifles failed to stop determined warriors, where tactical genius overcame technological superiority. The lesson remains relevant. Technology alone doesn't guarantee victory. Tactics matter, training matters, and never underestimate an enemy who understands war better than you do.